In the previous video, we have learned how to use the precedence graph to detect a conflict serializable schedule. In this video, we are going to understand the same concept using two-mode non-serial schedule with more number of transactions. So in the schedule 9, you can see that the first operation is done by the transaction 2, which is a read operation on the data item Z. The schedule 9 is given in the tabular form also. Whatever form you want to use for your understanding, you can use. So first what we need to do, we need to draw the nodes. Now if you go through the schedule 9, then you can see that there are three transactions, that is transaction 1, 2 and 3. There will be three nodes for transaction 1, one for transaction 2 and another one for transaction 3. Now the first operation is done by the transaction 2 on the data item Z. So if there is a conflict operation available of this operation, then the node or then the edge will be from transaction 2 to transaction 3. So the conflict operation is here, the W3Z. That is the conflict operation of the first operation. Here you can see that there is an operation on data item Z by the transaction 3 also, but it is a read operation. Read does not create any conflict. So the conflicting operation is this one and this one. So there will be a edge from T2 to T3 and on the data item Z. The next operation is reading of Y by the transaction 2. So its conflicting operation can be writing of Y by transaction 1 or transaction 3. So here are the conflicting operation. So from there you can see that the edge will be from transaction 2 and it will go to transaction 3 on data item Y, and there will be a edge from transaction 2 to transaction 1 for the data item Y. Next operation is writing of Y by the transaction 2. Its conflicting operation is the reading of Y by the transaction 3 and reading of Y by the transaction 1 as well as writing of Y by the transaction 3. So there are three conflicting operations. So edge will be from transaction 2 to transaction 3 and transaction 1 depending on the data item Y. So that is already present. The next operation is the reading by the transaction 3 on data item Y, and its corresponding conflicting operation will be writing of Y by the transaction 1, this operation. So this will conflict with this one. So there will be a edge from transaction 3 to transaction 1 on the data item Y. Next operation is reading of data item Z by the transaction 3 and there is no conflicting operation. The next operation is reading by transaction 1 on the data item X, and its corresponding conflict operation can be writing of data item Y by the transaction 2. So here is a edge from transaction 1 to the transaction 2 on the data item X. No further checking is needed because we can identify two different cycles available in this precedence graph. The first one is from transaction 2 to transaction 1, from transaction 1 to transaction 2. So this one, there is a cycle. Now the second cycle is transaction 2 to transaction 3, then from transaction 3 to transaction 1, then back to transaction 2. So the second cycle is covering all the three transactions. Now as we already know that schedule will be non-conflict serializable when there is a cycle in the precedence graph. So as there is a cycle in the precedence graph, the schedule 9 is not conflict serializable. Now other information what we get from the precedence graph is that The transaction 1 is dependent on transaction 2 to be completed because transaction 2 is holding the data item Y, whereas the transaction 2 is dependent on the transaction 1 to be completed on the data item X. As transaction 1 cannot complete until the transaction 2 is completed, and the transaction 2 cannot complete unless the transaction 1 is completed. That is why there is a cycle. And as there is a dependency between two transactions, or in this case all the three transactions, the schedule cannot be a conflict serializable schedule. So let us take another example. Let us take another example of schedule 10. Here there are, you can if you go through the schedule, you can find that there are three transactions like the previous case. So transaction 1, transaction 2, and transaction 3 will be my nodes of the precedence graph. Now we need to draw the edges, directed edges, using the conflicting operation. So the first operation is reading of data item Y by the transaction 3, and it will conflict with this operation, this one with this one, and as well as this one. So there will be a edge from T3 to T1 and T3 to T2 on the data item Y. The next operation is reading of data item Z by transaction 3. So edge, if there is a conflict, then the edge will be from T3, and there is no conflicting operation for this operation. The next operation is reading of data item X by the transaction 1, and its conflicting operation will be writing of data item X by the transaction 2. So this will conflict with this one. So there will be a edge from T1 to T2 on the data item X. We see all the three nodes are connected, but it is not creating any cycle yet. So let us go further and check other operations. Then there is a writing of data item X by transaction 1, so it will obviously conflict with this operation and this operation. So there will be an edge from T1 to T2 depending on the data item X, which is already present. Then the next operation is writing of data item Y by the transaction 3, which will conflict with writing of data item Y by the transaction 1 and writing of data item Y by the transaction 2. So there will be an edge from T3 to T1 and T2 depending on the data item Y, which is already present. Then the next operation is writing of data item Z by the transaction 3, and it will conflict with the reading of the data item Z by the transaction 2. So there will be a edge from T3 to T2 depending on the data item Z. The next operation is a reading operation by transaction 1 on the data item Y, which will conflict with the writing of data item Y by the transaction 2. So there will be a edge from T1 to T2 depending on the data item Y. Next operation is writing of data item Y by the transaction 1, which will conflict with once again this one. So it will be a edge from T1 to T2 depending on the data item Y, which is already present. The rest of the operations are done on the transaction 2, so there is no chance of any conflict operation because conflict operation happens in two or more different transactions. From the precedence graph is here, and you cannot find any cycle in the precedence graph. As the precedence graph is acyclic, then we can say that the schedule 10 is a conflict serializable schedule. Not only that, from here we can determine the transaction to be performed serially, the order of the serializable schedule. So you can see that the transaction after transaction 1, the transaction 2 will be completed because transaction 2 is dependent on the completion of transaction 1, and transaction 1 is dependent on the completion of the transaction 3. So the first transaction will be performed is transaction 3, which will be followed by transaction 1, which will be followed by transaction 2. So this will be the order of the serial schedule. We are going to compare the conflict serializable schedule with the view serializable schedule. We already know that every conflict serializable schedule is a view serializable schedule, but the vice versa is not true. To understand that, consider the schedule number 11. Here we can see that it is a view serializable schedule, and the serial schedule corresponding to this one will be T1 followed by T2 followed by T3. The schedule is not conflict serializable schedule because this is a conflict operation with this one, and this is a conflict operation with this one. So we cannot swap their order, so there is no possible conflict serializable schedule. As we know that to finding a view serializable schedule is very difficult. So the better approach will be we find the conflict serializability of a schedule. Now if the schedule is conflict serializable schedule, we can definitely say that it is a view serializable schedule. Now then the property of blind write comes into the act. So the last point, it says that every view serializable schedule which is not a conflict serializable schedule has a blind write. So using this property, we are going to draw a algorithm, or going to draw a flowchart by which we can identify a view serializable schedule uh, in a little bit easy manner. For that, what we need to do? First, we are going to look for conflict serializability. Now, if my answer is yes, we can say that the schedule is also view serializable schedule because each and every conflict serializable schedule is view serializable schedule. If my answer is no, then we are going to look for the blind write operation. If the schedule has no blind write operation, then we can say that the schedule is not a view serializable schedule. Now, if the schedule is having any blind write operation, then we have to check for view serializability using the sufficient condition, which we have discussed in the video lecture 4. So this is all about the serializability and the schedule. Remember, serial schedule or a serializable schedule gives us a consistent result or uh, consistent result in the database. But it does not ensure that the schedule will be recoverable or not. Recoverability means if there is a failure, then to ensure atomicity, we need to roll back the transactions present in the schedule. Now, will it be possible or not, and what will be the overhead for that one? That does not covered in case of serial schedule or the serializability of the schedule. For that, we need to know the idea of the recoverable schedule, cascading rollback, and cascadeless schedule. After that, we can go for the strict schedule, and how and what kind of schedule we are going to allow in our system, that will be discussed in the next video lecture. Till then, Stay safe and see you in the next video.